This is a video tutorial for the Mary, a wide-brimmed sun hat, and this is how you make it. You'll need to cut out one crown in outer fabric, one crown in inner fabric, 6 pieces of crown piece fabric in the inner fabric, and 6 pieces of outer fabric for the outer crown, and 1 tilly tie. You'll also need some interfacing to apply to the outer brim, as I've done. We'll start by making the brim. Place your 2 brim pieces right sides together. Ensure that the sides and the tops all line up, and then place some clips in. I've clipped all the way around the outer, and I've also added a few pins around the inner just to keep it still while we're sewing. Also, I've marked 5 centimetres from this edge down and made a mark, and I've done the same for this side as well. And I'm also going to do the inner. So get your ruler, make a mark exactly the same. And I'm going to take it over the sewing machine and starting at the mark I made there, the 5 centimetre mark, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew all the way around the clipped area. Take your time with this because it's quite a big curve until you get to this end, back stitch and stop. I've sewn from the 5 centimetre mark all the way around the outside curve using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've stopped at the other 5 centimetre mark. I've removed all my pins and clips, and now I'm going to turn the brim the right way around. Turn the brim the right way and I've pressed it. And now I'm going to sew a holding stitch around the inner circle of the brim, and starting at your 5 centimetre mark, sew very close to the edge all the way around. You could do this by hand if you wish, finishing at the other 5 centimetre mark. I've sewn really close to the inner brim, holding the outer and the lining together. And now I'm going to join the brim together. Take the outer fabric and place it right sides together. Match up the sides and edges. Pop some pins or clips in. Next, take it over the sewing machine and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sew across, joining the outer brim together. I've joined the outer brim, and now we're going to do the inner brim. And take your inner brim pieces and turn them right sides together. Now this is a little tricky, so take your time with this. Place them right sides together and make sure that the top all lines up. And as we did before, over to the sewing machine, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and sew across, joining the inner brim together. Sewn all along using a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the inner brim, and now it's starting to look like a hat brim. Press open your seams and fold in your raw edges and clip. Now take your time doing this so it's a nice shape, so it follows the round of the brim. Next, sew as close to the edge as you can all the way around. Take your time with this, and this will seal up the gap that we left and all the way back. I've sewn close to the edge all the way around the brim, and this will seal up the gap that we left. And now I'm going to put the brim to one side while we work on the crown. Next, we're working on the crown. You'll need to cut out 6 crown pieces of the outer fabric and 6 for the inner. And we're going to start by working on the outer crown pieces. Place 2 crown pieces right sides together, line up the bottom edges and the side, and then either pin or clip along. And then taking using a quarter of an inch seam allowance, start at the bottom of the crown piece and sew all the way around the curve to the very top and stop. Remember, we're only sewing the clipped side. I've sewn, starting at the bottom, all the way around the curve, and I've used a quarter of an inch seam allowance, and now I'm going to take it over to the iron and press open the seams. I've pressed open the seam, and now I'm going to add another section of the crown. Again, right sides together, line up the edges and the side and place some clips into place. I've clipped the third piece, and as we did before, starting at the bottom, using a quarter of an inch seam allowance, sew carefully all the way around to the top. I've sewn all the way around. I'm going to take it over to the iron and press open the seams, and then I'm going to repeat until we've got all 6 sewn together. I've sewn all 6 pieces of the outer crown, and now I'm going to put that to one side while I work on the inner crown. Now we're working on the inner crown. Take the first of your 2 inner crown pieces and place, as we did before, right sides together. I'm using plain fabric, but if you were using pattern fabric, this would be the pretty side, so to be pretty sides together. Line up your bottom edge and your side edge, and when you're happy with that, as we did before, add a few clips or pins and in exactly the same way as we did the outer, take it over the sewing machine, starting at the bottom, using a quarter of an inch seam allowance, sew carefully all around the curve to the very top. I've joined together and I've pressed open the seam, and as we did for the outer, I'm going to carry on joining the other remaining pieces. This will form the inner crown. I've joined all 6 pieces of the inner crown and I've pressed open the seams, and now I'm going to put it to one side for the moment. We're now returning to working on the brim. Take your brim and fold it in half using the seam that we made as halfway, and crease with your iron and this will give us exactly halfway around the brim. Open out and then using your heat erasable pen, mark along that crease. Open out your fabric and using the centre seam, line up the mark we've just made and ensure that the inner rim all lines up. Once you've got it lined up, press the two ends. Now, using your heat erasable pen, mark that crease and that crease as we did there. We now have the marks ready to put our outer crown in place. We've got the mark from the centre seam and the three other marks we've just made. Next, take your crown piece that you made earlier and open up your fabric and then match up two opposite seams and mark with a pen on both sides. And as I've done, press each of the opposite sides and mark with the heat erasable pen. Next, place the crown inside the brim, right sides together. The next step is to line up your marks. I always start with the back seam and I use the centre of one of the panels. I find this a lot easier because you don't have to ensure that your seams all match up neatly. Next, line up the marks directly opposite and add a clip and do the same for this side and this side. Once you've put in 4 clips, line up the edges and add another clip and do that all the way around again. I've added more clips all the way around and now I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to join the brim to the crown. Again, take your time doing this. I've sewn all the way around, joining the brim to the crown. And your hat's looking more like a hat. We're now going to join everything together. Turn your hat over and move the brim out of the way as I have done. Now we've got to put this inside this, and to do that, fold it up and place inside. Next, we've got to line up the seams on both pieces. Clip it together and then do the opposite side and clip. I'll clip the opposite seam and I'm going to carry on all the way around, ensuring that the top edge and all the seams match up and keeping the brim out of the way as I work my way around. Take your time with this. It's very important that they all match up, and they will. I've lined up all the top edges and I've ensured that the seams all match, and I've put lots of clips around, and I've remembered to leave a gap. And the next stage is to join it all together, and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew all the way around, remembering to leave a gap. I've sewn all the way around and I've remembered to leave a gap, and I'm going to turn it the right way through the gap I left. I've turned it the right way by pulling through the gap, and the next bit of sewing I'm going to do by hand is to sew up this gap. Fold in the raw edges and then get a needle and thread and ladder stitch across the gap. I've sewn up the gap, and I'd like to point out that the back is slightly narrower than the front, and that is correct. If you wish, you can sew lines all the way around as we do for the bucket hats. It's completely up to you. I'm now going to show you how to make the tilly tie to wrap around the hat. Again, this is optional. Fold your fabric in half. So if this was pattern, this would be the pretty side. So right sides together, and crease and press all the way down. It's quite a long piece, so take your time with that, and then put some clips in all along the length, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine and we'll sew all the way along using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, about halfway, and stop, leave a gap for turning, and then continue on the rest of the tilly tie. I've clipped all along, and I've remembered to leave a gap for turning, and I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, start on one of the ends and sew along to the corner and stop, and then carry on all the way around and stop and leave a gap, and then start again, carry on all the way down. It's quite a long piece of fabric, so take your time and stop there, and then pivot up to the end and stop. I've sewn all the way around using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've remembered to leave a gap. I'm going to turn it the right way round now through the gap I left. I've turned the tilly tie the right way around. I've folded in the raw edges and I've pressed it, and now I'm going to hand stitch the gap closed. I've turned the tilly tie the right way around and I've tied it around the Mary sun hat. You could of course leave it off, it's completely up to you. Or you could add a favourite scarf that you have, and that's your Mary wide brim sun hat all finished.